your complete silence for your President. Your complete silence, thank you, gentlemen, for your President. This is becoming an occasion which is much too frequent, but I must ask you now for your silence for your club President, Mr. Stan Veal.
Gentlemen, it is necessary that we honour the memory of several of our departed comrades. In accordance with our usual custom, I'll ask you to observe a few moments' silence. Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yes, I'm wearing my RSL badge now, but I don't always wear it. There are times, quite a lot of times, when I have had it in, younger people have said, "What's that badge?" "No, that's the RSL." Belong to that. And they've seemed surprised. They don't recognise it, and they don't especially want to. The war we were in is pretty remote from them, perhaps remoter than the previous war was to us when we were young soldiers. In those days, those of you who were in it then will remember, if you saw an RSL badge coming, you dodged. You didn't want that sort of beery sentimentality that was thrown at you. We didn't seem to be doing the sort of things that were talked about on Anzac Day and Armistice Day. We were embarrassed by them. I remember being in uniform at a school Anzac Day service. I couldn't have been more embarrassed. And today, I think young people particularly, the same thing applies. Their image of the RSL, particularly in New South Wales, is largely influenced by the RSL club. Especially if they live near one, they see the sort of poker machine, Sunday afternoon concert party, beer drinking couples and men, and they're not impressed. Why should they be? People talk about wearing your badge to honour the dead. I remember what the dead thought of it. We went to school with them, we served with them. They were the ones who, with us, dodged all this sort of thing. It's still useful, this badge. It's a status symbol. It still impresses a lot of people, that section of the population, middle age and over, who remember what it meant or what they think it meant. But to the largest section of the population, the young people, the children, it still doesn't matter at all, and why should it?
This is the badge of one of the most exclusive ex-soldiers organizations in the world. Its membership stands at 250,000, restricted to veterans who served in operational theaters of war. In recent years, it has become a powerful and controversial force in Australian politics, regarded by its admirers as the citadel of Australian nationalism, labelled by its critics as reactionary and militaristic. There is little doubt that governments listen when the RSL speaks. The Anzac tradition started on the slopes of Gallipoli in 1915 with what John Masefield called the finest body of young men ever brought together in modern times. The battle roll of the First World War is firmly embedded in our national consciousness. Lone Pine, Hill 60, Beersheba, Pozieres, Passchendaele, Villers-Bretonneux. 60,000 Australians were killed in that war, but 270,000 returned. And out of those who returned, often maimed, broken and disillusioned, yet still full of a strange pride of comradeship, grew the Returned Servicemen's League.
That's where they play. The RSL, the Return Services League, was conceived in the minds of the wounded returning from Gallipoli in 1915. They were determined that the wartime mateship should be maintained in civilian life. As a result, there was returned soldier organisations formed in each state of the Commonwealth. And in 1916, they federated into a Commonwealth organisation now known as the Returned Sailors Soldiers Imperial League of Australia.
After 1918, the memory of the war was kept alive mainly by the RSL, which soon became the chief political instrument in making sure that old soldiers and their dependents were not forgotten by governments. Repatriation schemes, war pensions and widows' pensions, legacy and land settlement, war service homes and returned soldier preference in job seeking, these were just some of the benefits that arose from the RSL's activities as a pressure group. These activities have recently been the subject of a study by a Canadian scholar at the Australian National University in Canberra, Jerry Christensen.
The Returned Soldiers League has always been a pressure group. Indeed, this was a role envisaged for it by the early founders of the League. Here it should be explained that a pressure group is any organization which attempts to influence government without taking office itself. And as such, a pressure group is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. Indeed, it's a necessary thing in a democratic society. League pressure group activity falls into two major categories. First, it is concerned with issues of concern to returned soldiers themselves. Secondly, it's concerned with issues of a broader national nature. And it is under this heading which we find matters of controversy today. These issues, of course, are defense, communism, and migration.
This estimate of the RSL's power in politics is supported by the Minister for Repatriation, Mr. Swartz. In RSL circles, I've often heard the Minister for Repatriation described as the Minister for the RSL. Do you think that's a fair description?
Well, I should say a reasonable description, because there is a very, very close association between the RSL and the Repatriation Department.
I believe you said once that the RSL is the only pressure group in Canberra with direct access to federal cabinet.
Well, I wouldn't refer to the RSL under any circumstances as a pressure group, but it is an organisation in the interests of ex-servicemen that approaches the government most regularly, and indeed it is the only public organisation in Australia that has direct and regular access to the federal cabinet.
Does that make it, do you think, probably the most powerful organisation lobbying here in Canberra?
Well, again, lobbying, of course, is not a very pleasant term, but on certain subjects, of course, it is the most influential organisation as a result of that, and principally on the subject of repatriation.
Does the RSL carry much influence with cabinet in other fields of politics, say defence, immigration and communism?
Yes, it certainly does. It does discuss with the government matters of defence. It is, of course, playing a very important part in an anti-communist campaign in Australia at the present time to make the Australian people aware of the great threat of communism that still does exist. And in many other fields in which its sphere of influence comes, it does play an important part.
Membership of the RSL declined in the 1930s, but was boosted again by the Second World War. It was the Second World War that gave the RSL more financial and political strength and led to the establishment of nearly 2,000 sub-branches throughout the Commonwealth. In addition to its own 250,000 members, the League now has a membership of 37,000 in its women's auxiliaries. A start has also been made in building up youth clubs in an attempt to keep alive the spirit of the RSL and to make it a continuing factor in Australian educational, social and political life. But according to some observers, this change of character in the RSL has not been to the good. One such critic is a prominent university student spokesman, Dr. Peter Walensky.
While everyone would support the welfare activities of the RSL, a lot of people show a lot of disquiet about the way in which they've entered the political arena. When the RSL considers any question, too often their answer to it seems to be to ban it, outlaw it, or suppress it in a way which causes an infringement of individual liberties. think this shows a somewhat tenuous belief in democratic procedures which I think are sufficient to meet most issues. And too often the RSL is ready to give up the civil liberties which they fought so hard to retain during the war. The other issue with which people would disagree is often the way in which they support their views. People who fought in the war certainly do have a right, in fact a responsibility, to speak up about major issues in Australian public life, but they're not always necessarily right. And the way in which they resort to name-calling to support their views instead of taking part in informed discussion is something that a lot of people object to. Many people who believe deeply in Australia disagree with the RSL in some of their views. But the RSL all too often seems to say, well, we fought for Australia, therefore we're right, and anyone who opposes us, they're an Australian scab.
Another critic is Alec Robertson, editor of the communist newspaper Tribune, an officer in both the Army and the Air Force during World War II, and a badge holder until the RSL expelled communists.
I think we had enough of the iron hand during the war, and most of us wanted to get back to a fair go for one and all after the war. As to the presentation of the idea of bans of political organisations and newspapers, it's my belief that this particular group, and it's our information that it is only a group in the leadership that is responsible for these policies, and that many of the members of the RSL are uncomfortable and opposed to the presentation of politics in advance of economic, pensions and other questions of interest. It is my belief that this group is very ignorant or chooses to ignore the tradition of struggle for democratic rights in Australia. Maybe these people hark back to the days when Australia was a military dictatorship, in the convict days, when all workers were compulsory workers, and even the death penalty was at hand for the military officers who ruled the country to go to work. So here you get the combination of the classical militarist brass hat position on the one hand, and a kind of politics that is espoused by the wealthy and powerful groups that in fact dominate the government and economic life in this country. There is no danger in the position, the views and the instinct of the majority of the Australian people. The real danger lies in the possibility that in backroom pressure and negotiations, this kind of brass hat group can panic or force a government in a period perhaps of international tension into restricting and frustrating the desires of the Australian people to build for themselves a secure and peaceful future.
That was the kind of criticism foreshadowed by D.H. Lawrence when he wrote his novel Kangaroo after a visit to Australia in the 1920s. One of the central figures in this book is a World War I digger who tries to organize returned soldiers into a political party which would preserve an aggressive military spirit. Lawrence sensed a jingoistic, super-patriotic strain in some Australians, and he thought it very dangerous. But when I was growing up in the 1930s, this particular RSL branch here at Caulfield in Melbourne was known to my family simply as the club. Through my father, a good deal of our activities seemed to revolve around it. There were RSL dances, the RSL ball, the RSL Christmas parties, and I remember too that I belonged to the RSL Junior Tennis Club. Not far away from here is the Caulfield Repatriation Hospital, which I used to pass every day on my way from school. In those days, I was never really aware of any political activities on the part of the RSL apart from returned soldier preference. After World War II, I joined not this branch but another branch in another city. If I'd come back to Caulfield to live, I might have joined Caulfield Central branch, which was formed by World War II men in 1946, mainly out of a grant given by this particular branch here at Caulfield, the main branch. I visited Caulfield Central today, the World War II club, and found that it now has assets amounting to £250,000. But for me, probably because of my upbringing, this particular RSL here at Caulfield represents the best of the feeling in the RSL.
Well, my opinion of the RSL and the policy that I've always had is that the greatest justification for our existence as an organisation is to combine together in an effort to help those of our pals who are less fortunate than ourselves.
Bill, what does the RSL mean to you?
At first, the comradeship of the First War, to which most of us here belong, even though we may not have served in the same units, it does bring you all together and you get something that you had in the First War, that was standing together. And secondly, we are doing something for those who are not perhaps as fortunate as we are.
Well, in the first place, comradeship, and secondly, it to me is a necessity that individuals can never state a case or make a claim whether it be reasonable or not, whereas a body like the RSL, so far as soldiers are concerned, and I think of 1418 as well as 3945, are able to express their views on matters in which soldiers still have an interest, so far as themselves are concerned and so far as the community in general is involved.
But whatever the RSL means to these men, the younger generation has a different view, reflected by the Copenhagen Downstairs Review in Sydney's King's Cross.
There's a place I hold very dear to me, a place that brings a cup of cheer to me, a shrine I like to call mine, a paradise of chrome that weaves a magical spell, a home away from home they call the RSL. We walk proud and bold through slops on the floor, through the empty schooner jungle, keeping us poor in that glittering citadel, the very, very RSL. Roll out the barrel, let's have one drink more, while the barman is pulling a fast one. Who cares a damn if there's another war? We're still fighting the last one. Mornings at 7 and all goes well. God's in his heaven, call the RSL.
But the real problem for the RSL is its future as a major force in Australian politics. This week I talked at national headquarters in Canberra with the RSL Deputy President, Sir Raymond Hewish. Sir Raymond, is it still part of the RSL's basic pledge not to take part in politics?
That is the pledge of the RSL at the present time, and I hope it will be for many, many years to come.
What are the terms of that pledge as given in your constitution?
I think I'd better give you the actual wording of it because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. Clause 3 of our policy reads as follows: the League shall be national and non-sectarian, and on all questions of party politics, as distinct from national questions as outlined in the policy of the League, shall maintain a neutral attitude. In other words, we don't take part in party politics.
Wouldn't you regard the RSL's pronouncements on defence, immigration and communism as essentially political?
They're all political matters, but they're not party political as far as the League is concerned. We look on those as national matters, and any organisation in Australia should be prepared to express its views on national matters.
If a future government decided to revise the present immigration laws and to admit Asians and Africans to this country under, say, a quota system, would the RSL object?
At the present time, under our policy, we would strongly object to such variation in our policy.
You think it might be possible for the RSL to bring pressure on any future government to prevent such immigration reform from being carried out?
I wouldn't like to say that, but we really would make our voice felt on any change of policy.
You're fairly confident of being able to impose the will of the RSL on all political parties?
If we have a matter of this worthwhile, we have been accepted by all parties. There's been an organisation prepared to put up reasonable suggestions. And we find provided we maintain that policy, governments will agree to the suggestions put up.
When you say that these questions like defence, immigration and communism are above party politics, don't you rather mean that the decisions of the RSL Congress are supposed to be accepted by all political parties in Australia?
Not necessary, sir.
Let's take this question, this rather ticklish question of communism. The RSL now wants to ban the Communist Party, to make it illegal. Despite the fact that at a referendum in 1951, the majority of the people decided that the Communist Party should not be illegal, should be allowed to function.
I don't agree with that. The referendum in 1961, wasn't it?
51.
51. There was more questions that people had to answer in addition to the communism. And my opinion why the people rejected the referendum was because in addition to asking as to whether they were agreeable to banning the Communist Party, they had to give answers to other questions which would encroach on the liberties of the individual.
If a referendum was held now, would the RSL campaign actively for a ban on the Communist Party?
If a referendum was held now and one question was asked to the people, that was, are you in favour of the Communist Party being banned? The RSL would strongly support it.
And assuming that the Labour Party would oppose a ban on the Communist Party, as it did in 1951, you would therefore be campaigning against the Labour Party?
We would be campaigning against the policy of not banning the Communist Party.
You would be campaigning against the Labour Party, in fact, and you would be taking part in party politics?
If that happened, we would be doing, yes. If that case happens,
If then the RSL is ready to become involved in party politics on one issue, it would probably be prepared to go in on other issues. This would lead to a basic change in its philosophy, its function, and its power structure within the Australian community. An important question facing the RSL is whether the rank and file of members would accept such a change. But more important still is the question of whether the Australian people as a whole would accept it.